What's up guys, Fedor Holz here, and today I'm hitting you with my top 5 bluff spots. So if you want to increase your non-showdown and red line winnings, watch this. This is for you guys out there, low stakes, mid stakes players aspiring to improve their game. You're going to have a lot of fun with this video. The first one is going to be super important for you, and it's particularly to attack checks. So when it's about attacking checks, there are 3 spots that I particularly like. The first one is as pre-flop caller in position. So someone open raised and we called in position. When they now check to you, this is a spot I really like to attack. There's 3 things that they normally do is A, they don't check raise enough. So that makes your bet a little bit better. B, they bet too many of their strong hands themselves. So their checking range is, depending on the board, generally a little bit weaker. And C, they also don't call enough. Their continuing frequency is generally also not high enough. So those 3 things combined lead to me really liking the stab in position when they check to you and we called in position pre-flop in a heads up pot, for example. The second one that is a really nice hotspot that is definitely underdone is as pre-flop caller out of position. So let's say button open raise or cutoff open raise and you defend the big blind. There is a flop like 9-6-3, for example, and it goes check, check. There's a deuce on the turn now. The really important part here, I would generally say simplified, is the card good for you or is it good for your opponent? If it's good for you, then this is a spot I would heavily go after. Most players don't continue wide enough, they don't fight back enough with their middling range or call you down lightly. And if they don't really improve on this card, they don't have these like really clear calls. Generally a spot I would say you basically never get raised and they don't continue enough. So I really like this as a spot to bluff. So when they check back on a flop like this and the turn is more favorable for your range and you have all the top pairs and all the second pairs and generally a lot of pairs and open-enders and gut shots, and you can also bluff rivers nicely depending on the runout. That's, I would say, the second spot I like a lot to attack checks. The third one is probably my favorite, and I would also say the one that will make you the most money because it's very hard and requires your opponent to play really good poker. And it's to attack your opponent's checks when he checks to you twice or even 3 times. We call it a delayed c-bet, for example. He checks to you, you check back, and now he checks again. And why is this such a profitable spot oftentimes to bet? Because your opponent has to balance his range properly between betting and checking. He needs some check raises, he needs some good check calls in there. And what just happens really often, especially when the boards are dynamic or when it's a board that you kind of know that they will just bet their strong hands, which very often is the case. So now all their strong hands go into their betting range and what's left in their checking range is just a weak range. And that's a range that we love attacking because when we bet, he's just having a lot of weak hands in his range. He doesn't have many traps, he doesn't have many strong hands. We don't get check raised that often. He doesn't have that much to check call with. So this is a spot that generally, depending on the board, but I would say majorly is a really good bluff spot. So a delayed turn c-bet or even a delayed river c-bet. Those are spots I would highly suggest you to look out for. Mainly think about the composition of your opponent's range. When the board structure is in a way where he will probably just bet most of his strong hands and he doesn't have many traps and he doesn't have that many medium strong hands to continue, these are the best spots to go after. Let's get to a bluff hotspot number 2, which is check raising flops. It's very particular about not only the spot itself, so to check raise the flop as a bluff, but it is really about the board structure. We want to choose a board structure where A, our opponent maybe bets too much or bets hands he's not supposed to bet, and or B, he doesn't call enough with hands that he's supposed to call with. And mostly it's a combination of both too. Like he maybe c-bets the flop too much and then ends up in a spot where he cannot continue with a lot of those hands and our check raise profits from that. Or he maybe c-bets the right amount of hands, but then when we check raise, he just folds hands that he's not supposed to fold and we profit from that. So that's generally the core idea why I would say check raising flops is a pretty nice hotspot. Now let's go to particular boards that I think are very nice. It used to be paired boards actually. I would say that people didn't call enough ace highs or king highs or generally didn't really float enough. It's not so much anymore. I would say right now currently what is a really nice hotspot is high low low rainbow boards, for example. So let's say king 6 deuce or queen 5 deuce rainbow board, I would say is a board that you get way more folds than you're supposed to. I like to check raise, and I would suggest you to check raise boards where they have to continue with unpaired hands. Backdoor flush draw, backdoor straight draw hands, for example. So king King Jack backdoor flush draw, King 10 backdoor flush draw, Jack 10 backdoor flush draw, stuff like that. All those hands have to continue, and that can even go as low as 6-7 backdoor flush draw, depending how deep you are. A lot of players don't find these continues, so they just fold too much on the flop when they don't have enough very clear continues. And to them, it might seem like, oh, I just call, ace king and better, but they have to defend much wider than that. And so that's why on a board like this, your check raise is going to be a really nice instant profit on the flop, and then you can still navigate on turns and rivers. And another board structure that I think is quite nice is rainbow disconnected boards, for example. Could be a Jack 6 deuce board, which I also think functions very nicely for check raises, kind of the same logic as the high-low-low board. Keep those in mind. I think they're going to bring you a lot of fun check raising and seeing your opponent fold regularly. The second quite nice check raising spot to go after is check raising flops as the pre-flop aggressor out of position. So we open raised and optimally a wider range, so maybe cut off a button, flatted in position, we get to a flop, and now we check to him, he stabs, and we check raise. This is actually, depending on the board, quite a nice spot and very opponent dependent, I would say. I really like to go after opponents here that I think that probably try to stab a bit too much, try to win pots and contest a bit too much. Against those, check raises function extremely well. When it's about hand selection, really try to pick hands that have some backdoor equity, so backdoor straight draw, backdoor flush draw, maybe 2 overcards, hands that can make some strong or very strong hands. And the deeper you get, the more important this becomes. But I would generally say that this is a spot where you can already profit from just having fold equity and more than you should or supposed to by check raising the flop if you identify the right spot or the right opponent, and I would say that comes up pretty frequently. So that's also a nice spot to go after. The third spot that especially aggressive high-stakes players love is barreling turns. There I would say, especially as a pre-flop aggressor in position in single raise pots and in 3-bet pots. In both just open raising and let's say big blind defense, or in a 3-bet pot where you 3-bet and your opponent defends. In both those spots, I would say there are some really nice hot spots that you can go after to double barrel. There's kind of 2 directions it can go, where either it's a overcard to the board where you're much more likely to have that and improves you to top pairs, and generally his range gets a bit weaker compared to yours, or it's a card that's maybe a second overcard to the board. So let's say it's King 8 deuce and then there's a 9 or a 10 or a Jack, where also he doesn't improve that much to second pairs and you do more. Those are spots that I would say are really nice hot spots to go after. It's not necessarily where I would say, oh, you can just highly overbluff this. It's even more important to just find the bluffs. Actually, not that easy to find the correct bluffs in those spots, because you have to find some hands that are just queen high, nothing, and non-equity bluffs, especially in these type of board structures. And that's not that easy and very unintuitive for a lot of players. So I wanted to bring up this spot because I would generally say that the majority of low or mid-stakes players are just too value heavy in this spot. So I'm overfolding this spot. I think a lot of other regulars are when you're out of position. For you as a mental note as well, in those spots when the turn card is good for you, or when the board structure changes a bit more in your favor than your opponent and you still have a lot of strong hands in your range, this is where you should really try to think for finding your bluff combos. That's going to be very important for you in this spot, so keep an eye out for number 3, bluffing turns and continuing barreling. Number 4, that's actually a very straightforward one, but one that absolutely prints, is squeezing, and particularly in 8 position. So let's say hijack opens, button flats, and you're in the big blind or in the small blind and you squeeze, and let's say we're 50 big blinds deep. That's a hot spot that most players do not defend enough in both positions, and it already starts in a pre-flop selection. It's a really big difference if the flatter has some back jams with like ace queen or some traps sometimes. Stuff like this is most players just do not have those traps, and it gets even worse when there's ICM in play and they just are extremely capped because they 3-bet, for example, all those hands and their flatting range is just medium strong stuff. In spots like this, I would say, especially when you know your opponent maybe flats too much or you know he's going to be rather passive, those are spots I would suggest you to go after quite nicely. Even your middling hands, don't do that well to just overcall. Just rather put them in your squeezing range, do it a bit more. We call it depolarized. Just take your Queen 9 suited or Queen 10 suited, functions pretty well in a squeeze folding range rather than overcalling and seeing a flop 3 or 4 way out of the small blind. So keep that in mind. This is going to be a really nice hotspot for you. You're going to love this one. It's a lot of fun too. You're going to be in a lot of dicey spots, but you will see this one's working pretty nicely. So keep an eye out for those juicy squeeze spots. The number 5, I call it the Brazilian. It's an homage to our Brazilian friends and regulars who absolutely love this one. And it's 3-bet or 4-bet or 5-bet bluffing against polarized ranges. It's something that they've been doing for quite some time. I think they identified that the population is doing this too much and really love, let's say, this trick. And it's basically, for example, when it's against late position, short stacks in ICM scenarios where your opponent is supposed to shove some hands. So now there's some stuff missing, and now he raises some strong hands and he raises some weaker hands. And what most players mess up is they just have too big of a raise fold gap. So they have too many weak hands, too little strong hands. And so a small non-all-in 3-bet works extremely well against them. And this could be in a variety of situations. This can be them open raising, can be in the small blind, for example. They open raise the small blind, a small 3-bet in the big blind. Can be printing extremely against opponents that just have too big of a raise fold gap. And then attacking them with small non-all-in 3-bet and 4-bet bluffs. It's a crazy tool, can work extremely well. So especially in low and mid stakes, if you find those players, if you identify those, go after them. Yeah, you'll love it. I made another video categorizing 6 different player types, and those 2 videos fit perfectly together. If you like this type of content, please support the channel, leave a subscribe. See you guys.